This is what happens when we lower our hiring standards, missed signs, sloppy documentation, a liability waiting to happen. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 43 minutes before Danielle Ross saved the life he refused to touch. Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah gleams under fluorescent lights, antiseptic smell sharp in every corridor. Danielle has worked here 8 months, her movements efficient and quiet, her scrubs perfectly pressed with parade ground precision. She adjusts an IV drip for Captain Chen in room 407, a Navy officer recovering from combat injuries, while her fingers trace the edge of a tarnished challenge coin in her pocket, the only physical connection to her son Marcus, who served under Chen in Tikrit. The coin is worn smooth from 18 years of handling, a reminder of sacrifice most people will never understand. Her forearm bears a faint scar, visible when she reaches for supplies, a thin pale line that tells its own story to anyone trained to read such things. She documents vital signs with unusual thoroughness, noting patterns other nurses miss. Her notes are meticulous, clinical, precise, the work of someone who knows that in medicine, details don't just matter. Details save lives. Dr. Caldwell enters during his morning rounds with 3 residents trailing behind him like ducklings behind a swan, their white coats too crisp, their expressions too eager. He reviews Chen's chart with deliberate slowness, his jaw tightening as he reads Danielle's notes. His presence fills the doorway like a storm gathering pressure. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that announces old money and older arrogance, Caldwell moves through Cedar Creek Medical as if he owns the very tiles beneath his feet. He does, essentially, serves on 3 hospital boards, chairs the cardiology department, controls 3/4 of the surgical privileges in a 50-mile radius. The residents wait. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song overhead. Nurse Ross, Caldwell says, voice sharp as a scalpel, my orders don't require your creative interpretation. He holds up her chart, pointing at her notation about medication timing. This change you documented, who authorized it? Danielle meets his gaze with zero expression, her hands continuing their work with the steady precision of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She adjusts the IV flow, checks the line for kinks, moves to the cardiac monitor. Her jaw tightens almost imperceptibly, but her voice remains level. Your order was 0800 hours, doctor. I documented the 0800 administration time. And yet, Caldwell says, turning to the residents with a thin smile, here we see exactly what happens when hospital administration prioritizes diversity over competence. This is what happens when we lower our hiring standards. He gestures at Danielle as if she's a specimen pinned to a board. Missed signs. Sloppy documentation. A liability waiting to happen. The residents exchange glances, uncomfortable but silent. One of them, the youngest, a woman barely out of medical school, looks directly at Danielle and then quickly away, shame coloring her face. Danielle doesn't blink. She doesn't flinch. She returns to her work as if he hasn't spoken, as if the weight of his contempt hasn't just landed on her shoulders in front of a room full of witnesses. Caldwell watches her for another moment, clearly expecting some reaction, some crack in the facade. When none comes, he turns on his heel and moves to the next patient, the residents trailing behind like obedient shadows. The room exhales when he leaves. The monitor beeps its steady rhythm. Chen shifts in his bed, his eyes tracking Danielle with new wariness, as if he's just witnessed something he didn't fully understand. But Caldwell isn't finished. Not even close. Danielle takes her break at 1,200 hours, heading to the vending machine corridor on the 3rd floor, a quiet stretch between the orthopedics unit and the administrative offices where most staff avoid congregating. She's reaching for black coffee, the kind that tastes like hot iron and regret, when she hears Caldwell's voice carrying down the hall. He's with 2 interns, younger men in pressed shirts and pressed futures, and he's talking loudly enough to ensure his words carry. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't need to. She's heard variations of this speech before. That nurse from earlier, Caldwell says, his voice dripping with false concern, Danielle Ross, I believe. Competent enough at basic tasks, I suppose, but she simply doesn't have the intellectual rigor for critical care. She might be much happier at a rural clinic where mistakes don't cost lives quite so publicly. where the standards aren't quite so exacting. One of the interns laughs, a short, sharp sound that echoes off the tile. Caldwell continues, warming to his theme. Some people reach their ceiling very quickly in an environment like ours. Cedar Creek has a reputation to maintain. We can't afford to carry people who don't belong at this level. Danielle stands at the vending machine, her coffee cup poised halfway to her lips, her knuckles white around the cardboard. She doesn't turn. She doesn't respond. She doesn't give him the satisfaction of watching her break. Instead, she drops 2/4 into the machine with deliberate precision, retrieves her coffee, and walks past all three of them without a flicker of reaction. Her shoulders back. Her spine straight. Her breathing controlled like a sniper settling into position. The interns fall silent as she passes. Caldwell's expression hardens when he realizes she's heard every word. He doesn't know yet that the quiet woman he's just humiliated has spent the last 3 months documenting every medication error he's made, every patient chart he's pre-signed without reviewing, every shortcut he's taken while wearing his reputation like armor. The stairwell door closes behind her. Alone, finally alone, her hand trembles as it grips the banister, not from fear but from the terrible calculus of restraint. Pain is information. Every insult, every dismissal, every public humiliation, it's all data, all evidence, all ammunition for the investigation she cannot yet conduct. Her son Marcus had served under Captain Robert Chen in Tikrit, and when that IED detonated beside their Humvee, it was Chen who dragged Marcus from the burning wreckage and carried him 3 miles to the forward operating base. 13 surgeries. 64% body surface burns. Marcus lived because Chen refused to leave him behind. And now Marcus's commanding officer is lying in room 407, recovering from shrapnel wounds that required hospitalization, and 7 days ago, classified information about Chen's unit, details that should have stayed buried in the Pentagon archives, had been leaked to a journalist investigating black site operations. The leak came from inside Cedar Creek Medical. Danielle was certain of it. Someone had accessed Chen's file, documented his real unit designation, identified him as the officer who'd conducted operations that certain officials wanted buried. The hospital had become ground zero for a security breach that could compromise active operations, endangered soldiers still deployed, and put Marcus's commanding officer in the crosshairs of people who preferred their secret stay secret. The Navy had quietly reached out to her 3 months ago. A single phone call, untraceable, from an admiral she'd served under in 2014. They needed someone inside Cedar Creek Medical. Someone with medical training. Someone who understood operational security. Someone who could move through the hospital without raising flags, who could review electronic records without triggering audit alerts, who could identify which staff member had access to Chen's classified information. Danielle had taken civilian leave from the reserve, secured a nursing position at Cedar Creek, and began the meticulous work of looking absolutely ordinary while watching everyone around her with the attention of someone trained to spot threats. What she hadn't anticipated was Dr. Caldwell. What she hadn't factored into the operation was that her presence would trigger someone's insecurity so profoundly that he would begin building a termination case against her with the same precision she was using to build a case against him. But that's what was happening. She could see it forming like storm clouds on the horizon. Caldwell felt threatened. By what, exactly, remained unclear, perhaps her competence, perhaps her refusal to defer to his authority, perhaps simply her presence as a symbol that the world was changing in ways he couldn't control. Whatever the cause, Caldwell had decided that Danielle Ross needed to disappear from Cedar Creek Medical, and he was the kind of man who made things happen. She stands in the stairwell for 90 seconds, her coffee cooling in her grip, and then she straightens. The trembling stops. Her breathing normalizes. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, a classified security clearance that the civilian nurses around her could never even imagine, takes a long drink of terrible coffee and heads back upstairs to room 407. Captain Chen needs his vitals checked at 1,300 hours. The medication rounds won't wait. And somewhere in Cedar Creek Medical's electronic records, someone is still leaving traces of their treachery, and Danielle will find them before this hospital becomes a casualty of their own carelessness. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead. The monitor in 407 beeps its steady rhythm. The very air seems to hum with the weight of secrets about to be revealed, of a reckoning no one yet sees coming. Danielle pushes through the stairwell door and walks toward whatever comes next with the absolute certainty of someone who has already survived the worst. She'd been walking these corridors for 8 months, and Dr. Caldwell had spent every one of them turning her into his personal teaching failure. The stairwell door swung shut behind Danielle as she descended toward the 3rd floor, her movements precise despite the tremor she kept locked inside her chest. What no one at Cedar Creek Medical understood was that every humiliation, every whispered dismissal, every public correction was actually surveillance, a carefully constructed cover story that let her monitor Captain Chen's medical file without raising flags. The Navy captain in room 407 had pulled her son Marcus from a burning Humvee in Tikrit 18 months ago. Marcus still didn't know she'd taken this civilian nursing position to investigate who inside this hospital was accessing Chen's classified service records, selling unit intelligence to people who had no business knowing where Charlie Platoon would be deployed next. But Caldwell didn't know any of that. Caldwell only knew that Danielle kept catching his mistakes, and mistakes threatened everything he'd built. She emerged into the hallway where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like mechanical insects and moved toward the medication dispensary on the 3rd floor nurse's station. Caldwell was already there, standing with his iPad, reviewing prescriptions for post-surgical patients. His shoulders were broad, his posture the kind of confidence that came from knowing your family had money older than some nations. Danielle had researched him during her first week, 3 hospital board positions, author of 23 peer-reviewed articles, a medical degree from Johns Hopkins and a teaching fellowship at Harvard. The kind of doctor who'd never been questioned, never been wrong, or at least never by someone like her. She approached the dispensary and began pulling medications for her assigned patients. Caldwell glanced up, then deliberately looked back at his iPad, waiting for her to make a mistake. She didn't. Captain Chen's cardiac monitoring shows some interesting patterns, Danielle said quietly, pointing to the chart she'd just reviewed. The digoxin dosage you ordered yesterday, that's 0.25 milligrams twice daily. She wasn't asking. She was confirming what she'd already documented. Caldwell's jaw tightened fractionally. The patient's renal function hasn't been rechecked since admission. At 72 years old with his surgical history, standard protocol would recommend verifying clearance rates before continuing that dose. Toxicity risk increases significantly. Caldwell set down his iPad with deliberate slowness. Are you suggesting I don't understand cardiac pharmacology, Nurse Ross? The way he said her name made it sound like a diagnosis. I'm reading the chart, Danielle said. Her voice didn't waver. The evidence suggests verification would be prudent. Caldwell smiled without warmth. The evidence? How charming. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday, the humiliation had escalated into something more structured, more dangerous. Grand rounds began at 9 a.m., and Caldwell had positioned himself as the architect of something that would have been funny if it weren't so calculated. He gathered 6 residents around Captain Chen's bed in room 407, gesturing at the monitors, the 4 lines, the careful documentation that Danielle had maintained across Chen's entire stay. Then he turned, caught her eye deliberately from across the room, and began. This is what happens when we lower our hiring standards, Caldwell announced, his voice carrying to the hallway and beyond. Missed signs. Sloppy documentation. A liability waiting to happen. The resident shifted uncomfortably. Danielle's jaw tightened fractionally, but her hands remained perfectly steady as she adjusted the 4 drip rate, checking the flow rate with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from training that lives in muscle memory, not conscious thought. One resident, a woman who looked barely older than the interns, asked about Chen's post-surgical protocol. Caldwell redirected instantly, his voice sharp. Let's focus on what competent nursing looks like first. Then we can discuss advanced topics. The room went dead silent. Danielle wrote numbers on Chen's chart, vital signs, medication times, observations, with a hand that didn't shake. Later that day, near the third-floor vending machines where the break room's fluorescent light cast everyone in a sickly greenish pallor, the real performance began. Caldwell was speaking to the chief of surgery, deliberately loud enough that anyone within 15 feet could hear every word. Two interns stood frozen by the coffee station, their styrofoam cups forgotten. Nurse Ross might be happier at a rural clinic, Caldwell said, his voice carrying that particular cadence of someone who'd practiced being devastating. Somewhere her skill set matches the patient population. Somewhere mistakes don't cost lives. The chief of surgery didn't respond, which was almost worse than agreement. Danielle walked past carrying her coffee, her expression absolutely neutral, not a flicker of reaction, not a change in her breathing pattern. Only her hands gave her away, just barely. Her knuckle went white where it gripped the plastic coffee cup, and a single stress fracture appeared in the lid. She climbed the stairwell alone, 3 flights up to the break room on the 5th floor, where she sat in the corner and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds to feel what was happening. The challenge coin Marcus had given her before his last deployment was heavy in her scrub pocket, worn from 18 months of constant contact. It had come from Captain Chen himself, a tarnished coin, bronze and silver mixed together, with a Navy SEAL trident barely visible through decades of oxidation. "For your boy," Chen had said, pressing it into her palm before Marcus deployed. "So he knows someone's got his back." Danielle had kept that coin through every training deployment, every operation, every moment of her career. She pulled it out now, ran her thumb across its surface, and let it ground her. The metal was cold. It never lied. The next day brought the formal phase of Caldwell's assault, the moment when his strategy shifted from public humiliation to institutional sabotage. He called her into his office at 2:48 p.m. with a witness present, the nursing supervisor, a woman named Helen who looked deeply uncomfortable. Caldwell gestured to a chair. His desk was surgical in its organization, pen set at a precise angle, nameplate centered. "I'm documenting a pattern of insubordination," he said, and slid a form across the desk as if presenting evidence. "You questioned my medication orders in front of staff yesterday. You're creating a hostile environment for physicians. This behavior cannot continue." Danielle picked up the form without reading it. The words were probably rehearsed, probably carefully chosen to avoid anything actionable. She signed the acknowledgement, her signature perfectly legible, perfectly controlled. Helen watched this happen without speaking. 3 more incidents like this, Caldwell continued, and we have grounds for immediate termination. I trust we're understanding each other. Danielle slid the sign form back across the desk. I understand. She stood. That was it, 7 words, delivered with the kind of flat calm that comes from someone who has survived worse than career destruction. She left the office, and Caldwell filed the paper in her personnel file, telling Helen, document everything she does. Every medication check, every question about protocols. I want a complete record. Helen nodded, uncomfortable but compliant. The machinery was in motion now. Caldwell's motivations were ruthlessly simple, the kind of clarity that only came from someone protecting something precious. Danielle had threatened him, not through any grand gesture, but simply through competence. She caught his shortcuts, questioned his judgment, documented everything thoroughly enough that her presence made his presence look sloppy by contrast. 3 hospital board positions depended on an unblemished record. Medical liability insurance depended on appearing flawless. Reputation depended on never being challenged by someone like her, someone without credentials to match his, someone he could dismiss without professional consequence. So he decided to destroy her methodically, building a termination case the way a surgeon would build a case against an infection, methodically, deliberately, using every tool available. Policy violations. Performance reviews weaponized like scalpels. Witnesses who'd attest to her pattern of concerning behavior. By the time he was finished, she wouldn't just be fired, she'd be unemployable. The investigation would follow her career forever. That night, Danielle sat in her apartment in Savannah, a small 1-bedroom rental near the river, and pulled Chen's entire classified service file on her secure terminal, the one part of her actual mission that took precedence over the hospital politics. She cross-referenced his secret injury reports against his current symptoms, documenting everything in code that would make sense only to her handlers at Naval Special Warfare Command. The scar tissue from where shrapnel had pierced his chest cavity near the 7th intercostal space, that was the real reason she was here. Someone in this hospital had accessed his service records 6 times in the past 3 months. Someone with hospital credentials was systematically copying details about Chen's unit movements, deployment schedules, combat operations. That someone was still in the building, still moving freely, still unaware that a Master Chief Petty Officer was sitting in their system, tracking every move. But that wasn't the only thing the military had asked her to watch. They'd also asked her to stay invisible, to maintain her cover, to not let anyone know what she really was. Caldwell's humiliation campaign didn't matter if it kept her position secure long enough to identify the leak. Danielle had survived Tikrit. She'd survived IED blasts that killed soldiers standing 3 feet away. She'd survived interrogation, extraction, and firefights where the rounds came close enough that she'd felt the heat from their passage. She could survive a doctor's contempt. What she couldn't survive was Chen's unit getting destroyed because someone inside this hospital was selling them to people who would hunt them across continents. So she returned to Cedar Creek Medical the next morning, clocked in at 7 a.m., and began another shift in room 407, watching, waiting, documenting. The challenge coin remained in her pocket. The real battle was still coming. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what would happen when Captain Chen's heart finally failed, when the monitors began their urgent arithmetic, when 7 doctors who couldn't see what was happening would decide to let a hero die rather than risk their reputations. The clock was ticking toward that moment, and Danielle was the only person in the hospital who understood what was actually at stake. At 11:13 p.m., Danielle sat alone at the nurse's station of the cardiac wing, the fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical lullaby above her head. Captain Robert Chen's file lay open on the desk in front of her, not the official Cedar Creek Medical chart with its plastic tabs and sanitized observations, but the classified report that had arrived in her encrypted email 3 weeks prior, the one that existed nowhere in any hospital system. She cross-referenced his documented Tikrit injury reports with the current cardiac workup, her finger tracing the timeline like a combat medic reading a wound. Shrapnel fragmentation, 2011. Left lateral thorax penetration. Scar tissue development across the pericardium consistent with post-traumatic calcification. The words stared back at her in clinical precision, each one a warning. She understood what none of the other physicians at Cedar Creek Medical seemed to grasp. Captain Chen's heart wasn't just sick, it was architecturally compromised. The combat injuries that had nearly killed him in Tikrit had left adhesions and fibrotic tissue that now clung to his cardiac sac like a second skin. If his heart began to fail, any standard intervention carried risks that would terrify most surgical teams. An echocardiogram could damage the fragile tissue. A pericardiocentesis, the needle puncture required to drain fluid from around the heart if tamponade developed, would require someone who understood not just anatomy, but the specific anatomy of a combat casualty. Someone who had performed emergency procedures on soldiers with similar injuries while incoming fire drummed against reinforced bunkers. Someone who could thread a needle through scar tissue with the precision of someone who had already done it once under mortar fire. Danielle knew that someone. She was staring at her own reflection in the darkened computer monitor. She pulled up his latest vitals, heart rate 68, blood pressure 127/82, oxygen saturation 97% on room air. Stable. For now. The cardiac rhythm on the monitor was sinus, steady, reassuring in the way that only electrocardiograms could be, a line that said the worst hadn't happened yet. But she had seen enough combat casualties to understand the mathematics of deterioration. Chen's ejection fraction was 38%, hanging at the edge of acceptable like a man on a cliff face. The inflammatory markers were creeping upward. C-reactive protein at 7.8. The body was telling a story, and the story was about compromise, about systems pressed to their limits, about the delayed consequences of trauma that didn't kill you the first time. She checked the chart again. No calls to interventional cardiology. No echocardiogram scheduled for tomorrow. No contingency plan documented for what would happen if Captain Chen's tenuous cardiac stability began to unravel. Cedar Creek Medical had no idea what it was holding in room 407. It saw a 62-year-old man with a bad heart. It didn't see a Navy captain whose heart had survived a direct hit and now carried the scars of that survival in every beat, every breath, every moment of exertion. Danielle's fingers moved to her pocket, found the weight of the challenge coin, the tarnished silver disc that Marcus had pressed into her hand before she deployed to Tikrit, a coin his commanding officer had given him, with Chen's call sign stamped into the metal. Phantom 6. That was Chen's designation from the operation. That was the man who had pulled her only son from burning wreckage while bullets sparked off Humvee armor. The coin was warm from her body heat, real, grounding. She returned the classified file to its encrypted folder and logged out. The clock on the wall read 11:53 p.m. Her shift extended to 7 a.m. She took her position at the nursing station, monitoring the cardiac monitoring system from her desk, watching the row of screens that displayed patient vitals in real time. Room 407 was third from the left. Chen's waveform was steady, predictable, almost meditative in its regularity. She could watch that line for hours. She probably would. At 1:34 a.m., everything was still quiet. Danielle had done her midnight rounds, adjusted Chen's for flow rate, checked his pain medication, confirmed that he was resting. He had slept, though when she had entered the room, his eyes had tracked her movement, still alert, still aware, still the vigilant consciousness of someone trained to notice threats. She had placed her hand briefly on his wrist, feeling the pulse, and he had not spoken. Neither had she. Some communications don't require words. At 1:58 a.m., the cardiac monitor above her desk screamed. The alarm was a shrieking wail, the sound of a system detecting catastrophe. Danielle's eye snapped to the screen. Room 407's waveform had transformed. The steady sinus rhythm had become erratic, chaotic, the line spiking and collapsing like a seismic readout of something breaking deep underground. Heart rate 142 and climbing. Blood pressure 89/54. Dropping. Still dropping. She was already moving. Training doesn't ask permission. Muscle memory becomes reflex, becomes muscle, becomes movement. Danielle ran toward room 407, her trauma shears clinking against the stethoscope around her neck, her shoes striking the tile floor with the sharp percussion of someone who had learned to move fast through dangerous spaces. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, stretched like a nightmare, though she covered the distance in less than 8 seconds. She pushed through the door to find Captain Chen barely conscious, his body soaked with the cold sweat of decompensation. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor of someone whose cardiovascular system was failing, the color draining from his face like water from a sink. His eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated, the terrifying calm of someone whose brain wasn't receiving enough oxygen. His breathing was shallow, rapid, inefficient, a man suffocating while air surrounded him. "Captain, I'm here," Danielle said quietly. She didn't touch him yet. She was reading him, scanning his condition the way she had scanned hundreds of trauma patients in field hospitals: peripheral perfusion clammy, breathing labored, altered mental status. The constellation of signs pointed toward one emergency. His heart was failing to pump blood. His pericardium, the sac surrounding his heart, was likely filling with fluid. Cardiac tamponade. The pressure was suffocating his own heart. Without intervention in minutes, not hours, his heart would stop. She reached for her radio. Code blue, room 407. Cardiac wing. Possible acute tamponade. Her voice was steady, professional, clinical, the voice of someone who had called dozens of codes, who had narrated the controlled chaos of emergency response with the same composure others used to order coffee. Activate crash team. Notify Dr. Caldwell. All hands to 407. The hospital's infrastructure responded. Boots pounded through the corridors. The pneumatic hiss of a crash cart being wheeled at speed. The sound of cabinet doors opening, hands moving through organized chaos, the practiced efficiency of a team that had drilled this scenario 100 times. Within 90 seconds, the room was full. Resident physicians. Attending cardiologists. Respiratory therapy. Nursing assistance. The crash cart with its defibrillator pads and medication trays and emergency equipment arranged like instruments on a surgical field. And standing at the center, blocking the view of Captain Chen's chest, was Dr. Caldwell. He had arrived in full protective armor, his lab coat unbuttoned, his ID badge swinging, his expression already set into the rigid mask of someone preparing to exercise authority. Behind him came two others, hospital administrators. Danielle recognized them from the cafeteria conversations. Legal. They always brought legal to the codes now. Risk management. Liability assessment. The slow bureaucratization of emergency medicine. What's the presentation? Caldwell demanded, not looking at Danielle, not acknowledging the nurse who had called the code, who had been monitoring this patient's deterioration while he slept. Acute decompensation, one of the residents began. BP dropped from 127 to 89 in under 2 minutes. EKG shows. Pulses paradoxus, Danielle said quietly, from the edge of the room. Listen to his breathing rhythm against the monitor. See how the waveform dips with inspiration? His pericardium is filling. His heart suffocating. Caldwell turned to face her for the first time. His eyes were cold, the eyes of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to exercise power over someone he had already decided was inadequate. Nurse Ross, step back. This is attending-level care. Danielle didn't step back. She moved closer to Chen's bedside instead, close enough to see the dilation of his pupils, the desperate shallowness of his breathing, the way his fingers were already becoming cyanotic as his oxygen saturation fell. 93%. 91%. 89%. He needs a pericardiocentesis, Danielle said. Not a request. A statement of fact, the way one might say the sky is blue or gravity exists. His pericardium is compromised from combat trauma. The approach needs to account for scar tissue adhesions. It needs to be done now. The room went still. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of collective hesitation, the sound of 7 doctors realizing they were being asked to perform a procedure on a complicated case, on a patient whose anatomy had been fundamentally altered by violence and time. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Danielle could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the liability assessment, the malpractice consideration, the question of whether the risk of doing something exceeded the risk of doing nothing. No one performs any procedure, Caldwell said, until legal has reviewed the case. Where is the family consent form? Has anyone contacted the family to authorize an emergency intervention on this patient? One of the administrators pulled out a phone. I'm calling the emergency contact. It's going to take time. We need consent documentation for anything invasive. Captain Chen's oxygen saturation was now 87%. His heart rate had become irregular, the monitor showing occasional ectopic beats, the electrical system of his heart firing in desperation. He was dying in front of them, in front of 7 physicians who had the training and equipment to save him, and they were discussing paperwork. Danielle looked at Caldwell. She looked at the legal representative. She looked at the residents who had been trained to save lives but were now being told to wait for documentation. Then she looked at Captain Chen, Marcus's commanding officer, the man who had taught her son how to survive, who had pulled him from fire, and she made a decision. She reached for the procedure cart. Nurse Ross, I am explicitly ordering you to step away from that patient, Caldwell said. His voice had risen, taking on the sharp edge of authority being challenged. I am reassigning you to the 4th floor, effective immediately. Another nurse will assume monitoring of Captain Chen. You are removed from this case. Danielle didn't remove her hands from the pericardiocentesis kit. She pulled out the 18-gauge needle, felt its weight in her palm, registered the slight resistance of the sterile package. Her hands were absolutely steady. Not the steadiness of someone without fear, but the steadiness of someone who had performed this exact procedure while mortars fell outside a medical tent in Tikrit, while soldiers screamed in the darkness, while the power kept cutting out and she had worked by chemical light, threading a needle between the ribs of a man whose heart was already failing. No, doctor, Danielle said. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Caldwell's face darkened. "What did you say?" "No," Danielle repeated. She turned to face him fully, still holding the needle. "You're not competent to assess this case. You don't understand combat trauma to the pericardium. You don't understand scar tissue adhesions. This patient is going to die in the next 4 minutes if we don't act, and you're more concerned about liability than about his life." The room had become very quiet. The monitor was still screaming, 82% oxygen saturation now, the heart rate becoming more irregular, the electrical system of Chen's heart beginning to fail as the physical pressure around it prevented effective contractions. They had maybe 3 minutes left. Caldwell reached for the room's phone, his finger stabbing at the button with the fury of someone finally being given permission to act. "Security! I need an escort to remove a staff member from patient care immediately. Room for 07. Now." Danielle positioned the ultrasound probe against Chen's chest, her hands moving through the muscle memory of 1,000 field procedures, finding the space between his ribs, identifying the acoustic window, visualizing the fluid, dark, echogenic, filling the pericardial space like a thief stealing the room his heart needed to beat. She had 30 seconds at most before security arrived. Maybe less. She marked the spot with her finger. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The same position she had used 18 years ago in a field hospital while incoming fire snapped overhead. The needle went in smooth and steady, the angle precise, the depth exact. The hiss of air escaping as the syringe met the pericardial fluid. Dark fluid, pulling back into the syringe like the hospital was exhaling. Behind her, boots thundered in the stairwell, the sound of security moving toward her at speed. The needle went in. Dark fluid, pulling back into the syringe like the hospital was exhaling. Behind her, boots thundered in the stairwell, the sound of security moving toward her at speed. Danielle didn't pause. 120 milliliters. 130. The monitor alarm stopped screaming. Captain Chen's oxygen saturation climbed, from 68 to 74 to 81, the numbers rising like a man surfacing from deep water. His blood pressure stabilized. Color returned to his face like someone remembering how to breathe. His eyes opened. Focused. Aware. "Master Chief," he whispered, the words so quiet only Danielle heard them, a rank spoken like a prayer of recognition. Security arrived. 2 guards, moving fast. Their shoes echoed on tile. Caldwell's voice cut through the postcode silence like a blade, "Escort her out. She's terminated effective immediately. That was an unauthorized procedure. She has no right." He pointed at Danielle with a hand that trembled, not from fear but from something darker. Rage. The kind that comes from losing control in front of witnesses. In front of residents. In front of nurses who would whisper about this moment in the break room for years. Danielle set down the syringe with the same care she'd used to insert it. She removed her gloves, one finger at a time, peeling each layer away. The sound of latex snapping was the only noise in the room now. All 7 of the doctors who'd stood in that hallway, refusing, had gone silent. They watched her walk between the guards without a word. Her face showed nothing. No tremor. No defiance. No regret. Just the blank composure of someone who had already calculated every consequence and decided they were worth the cost. The tarnished challenge coin sat heavy in her scrub pocket as she walked past the monitors and the fours and the machines that would keep Captain Chen alive through the night. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the hospital had shifted into that strange quiet that comes before dawn, the kind of silence where fluorescent lights hum louder than they should, where the ventilators sound like mechanical breathing, where a single footstep echoes down an empty corridor like a verdict. Dr. Caldwell sat in his office on the 3rd floor, the dark outside the windows absolute and impenetrable. He picked up his phone. His hands were steady. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man who understood institutional power the way other men understood oxygen. He called the hospital board president at home. Woke him. "We have a liability incident requiring immediate action," Caldwell said, his voice like a knife wrapped in velvet. A nurse performed an unauthorized invasive procedure without consent, without attending physician approval, without following protocol. She endangered the patient. The hospital is exposed. The board president, still half asleep, listened. Caldwell's words had a way of cutting through fog. Next call, Tennessee. Danielle's nursing school. 3 hours ahead of Savannah, already approaching dawn. A registrar's answering machine took his message. This is Dr. Charles Caldwell, Chief of Internal Medicine at Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah. I need Danielle Ross's complete educational file, reference checks, any disciplinary records, any complaints from clinical rotations. This is urgent. Call me back within the hour. He left his direct line. He hung up without saying goodbye, not rudeness, just efficiency. The efficiency of a man liquidating a problem. By 4:17 a.m., Caldwell had activated his network fully. An outside investigator named Dwight Pierce, based in Atlanta, board-certified in healthcare compliance, with connections to hospital administrators across the Southeast, arrived at Cedar Creek by 6:51 a.m. with 2 associates carrying boxes of files. Caldwell had given him a simple directive: audit every chart Danielle had touched in 8 months. Every medication order. Every notation. Every signature. Find something. Anything. A crossed-out line that looked suspicious. A note written at an odd hour. A medication dose that seemed questionable. Build an iron case. Make it so airtight that no hospital in Georgia would hire her, no licensing board would defend her, no appeals process would matter. Make her unemployable. Make her invisible. This wasn't just termination, this was institutional erasure, the slow suffocation of a career, the kind of careful documentation that would follow her for years. Danielle entered the hospital laundry room alone at 6:52 a.m. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in that particular way that makes your teeth ache. The room was warm, industrial dryers roaring somewhere in the back, the smell of bleach and detergent mixing into something sterile and final. She had a laundry bag of scrubs. The blue one she'd worn for 8 months. The one she'd worn when she'd caught Caldwell pre-signing a medication order he hadn't approved. The one she'd worn when she'd documented his patient's deteriorating mental status, the notes that might have saved him if anyone had listened. The one she'd worn while pretending to be just a nurse. She folded them. Crease by crease. Sleeve against sleeve. The same way she'd learned to fold uniforms in boot camp, the same way she'd packed gear for deployments, the same way she'd prepared for operations where precision meant the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were dry. A laundry worker passed by the open doorway, an older man with gray at his temples, and he glanced at her but said nothing. Some silences don't require explanation. The challenge coin sat in her pocket. She'd carried it for 3 years. Marcus had given it to her before his last deployment. "So you remember," he'd said. "So you remember I made it home once. In case you need proof that it's possible." The coin was tarnished now, the Navy emblem worn smooth from being held, from being touched, from being proof of something that the hospital would never understand. She placed the last folded scrub in the plastic bag. The bag was white. Disposable. The kind of thing you throw away without thinking. What they didn't know was standing in a bed in room 407, stable and breathing and thinking about the hands that had saved his life when 7 doctors had decided he wasn't worth saving. 3 days later, the hospital received a trauma admission, a middle-aged man, unconscious, from a car accident on Victory Drive. The paramedics had found him trapped in his sedan with Iraqi identification in the glove compartment. His name was Rashid. He'd been in the United States for 8 years, working as a contractor, building a new life in a country that had been his workplace for 3 years before that. Before he woke up, before his eyes focused, before he remembered where he was dreaming of Tikrit. Of dust roads. Of a woman in full tactical gear moving through his neighborhood like something that didn't fear anything. Of that same woman taking shrapnel that was meant for him. Danielle visited Captain Chen in the afternoon. Room for '07. No longer her patient, no longer her assignment, no longer anything official. She wasn't working. She'd been fired. She had nothing left to lose in her cover identity because the cover was already destroyed. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a grey hoodie. She brought him coffee from the cafeteria. The kind that tasted like it had been brewed in a machine designed by someone who'd never actually tasted coffee before. Chen smiled anyway. She was turning to leave when she heard it. From the adjacent ICU bay, the sound of an IV ripping free. An alarm. Movement. A voice in accented English, hoarse and urgent, Phantom. Phantom 6 from Tikrit. It's her. It's her. The translator. Rashid. Who had worked alongside her unit in 2006. Who had lived through 3 days trapped in a basement after his village was cleared. Who had watched her move through darkness the way other people moved through daylight. Who had whispered her call sign like a prayer in the Tikrit dust. Danielle turned. She saw him, eyes wide, reaching past the IV stand, one hand trembling with something beyond pain. She saw him recognize her. She saw him understand that the story he'd carried for 17 years, the story about the American operator who'd moved like smoke, who'd found him when everyone else had given up, was standing in his hospital room. A security guard heard it. Walsh, a retired Marine, 3 years on the Cedar Creek job, clipboard in hand, reviewing discharge paperwork. He'd heard the call sign and his entire body went rigid. He stepped closer to the doorway. He stared at Danielle, really stared, as if seeing her for the first time, as if the past 8 months of watching a quiet nurse shuffle through the hospital had suddenly transformed into something else entirely. "Wait," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "You're calling her Phantom 6? That's a Master Chief Petty Officer's call sign. Navy Special Operations." The words traveled. Down the hallway. Into the ears of the charge nurse. Into the ears of the residents passing by. Into the ears of the staff who'd watched Danielle get escorted out by security 72 hours earlier, humiliated, terminated, the woman who'd performed unauthorized procedures, who'd violated protocol, who'd endangered patients. Now they heard her call sign and they understood that they had been looking at something they couldn't see. The intercom clicked. "Vice Admiral Morrison, Dr. Chen is ready for you on the 3rd floor. A Navy Admiral. Arriving at Cedar Creek Medical. In Savannah. To check on a captain's recovery." Morrison had been notified of the cardiac incident through official channels. His presence wasn't routine, it was recognition that something classified was being protected. He walked into the hallway 8 minutes later. Tall. Uniform so crisp it looked like something that could cut. He saw Danielle and something in his face shifted, recognition, the kind that comes from having seen the same person in a different uniform, in a different life, in a ceremony in San Diego 4 years ago. He turned to the gathered staff. His voice was formal. Deliberate. Each word placed like evidence in a trial. "Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross," he said. He paused. Let the rank settle. 3 combat deployments. Another pause. Bronze Star with Vela device. He waited. The hallway had stopped breathing. And a second Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal. The translator began to cry. Classified medical operation in Tikrit, 2006. 17 lives saved. Embedded translator among them. He turned slightly. Looked directly at the nurses, the doctors, the staff watching. Medical intelligence analyst currently assigned to investigate security breaches related to Captain Chen's unit. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of absence. The silence of understanding flooding in all at once. Of 8 months of careful documentation suddenly meaning something entirely different. Of a woman who'd stood in front of God and a dozen doctors and picked up a needle and saved a life while the institution tried to stop her. Captain Chen sat up in his bed. For lines running to his arm. Monitors attached to his chest. He spoke clearly enough that everyone heard. Master Chief Ross took shrapnel meant for my vehicle in Tikrit. She was on medical leave, recovering from her own wounds. She took this nursing assignment to make sure I made it home. My unit had a leak. Someone was accessing our classified casualty reports. She was here to find them. At the far end of the hallway, visible through the doorway to the stairwell, Dr. Caldwell's face went grey. Not the grey of age or illness. The grey of a man watching everything he'd built suddenly reveal itself as constructed on sand. The investigator he'd hired, Dwight Pierce, was standing 6 feet away. They'd been walking toward the administrative offices to discuss findings. Now Pierce was staring at Caldwell. At his face. At the color draining from it like someone had opened a valve. Pierce turned toward the Admiral. Toward the gathered staff. Toward the woman in the grey hoodie who'd been folding scrubs in the laundry room 3 days ago. "Sir," Pierce said quietly, "I think we need to talk about your medical license." Security walked Danielle out of Cedar Creek Medical at 6:27 a.m. on a Tuesday, her badge clipped to their belt instead of hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply followed the guard's gesture toward the employee exit, her scrubs already changed to street clothes, her locker sealed with a zip tie that read terminated, "Do not open." The rain started before she reached her car. Not gentle rain. The kind that hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. By noon, she was alone in the Cedar Creek Hospital laundry room, folding her scrubs for the last time. The industrial washers hummed their mechanical rhythm. Steam rose from the pressing station where she creased each edge with parade ground precision, the same precision that had guided a needle between a man's ribs at 2:36 a.m. to save his life. She folded the blue fabric into perfect thirds, then quarters. Each fold a small meditation. Each fold a small goodbye. The tarnished challenge coin sat heavy in her scrub pocket. Bronze, worn smooth by 1,000 hands. Marcus's commanding officer had given it to him in Tikrit with a single sentence, "You brought my people home." Now the coin was hers. Now it was evidence of something she could never explain to anyone who would ask. She held the folded scrubs against her chest. The fabric still smelled like antiseptic and her own sweat. She was still wearing the whites of someone who had saved a man's life. She was still holding a coin that proved she had done something that mattered. But the hospital had made her invalid. Caldwell had made sure of that. And she had let it happen, because the mission required her to be invisible, and invisible people don't file complaints or demand apologies. Invisible people fold their scrubs and walk out into the rain. 3 days later, an unconscious trauma patient arrived at Cedar Creek Medical by ambulance, loaded through the trauma bay with burns on 60% of his body and a steering wheel imprint crushing his ribs. Car accident on IU-95, northbound. Head-on collision with a fuel truck. The ER team intubated him, got him stabilized, and admitted him to the ICU for observation. He spent 48 hours unconscious. On the morning of the 3rd day, his eyes opened. Danielle was visiting Captain Chen in room 407, sitting beside his bed while he slept, watching his chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of a man who would live. She had no authority to be there. She had no clearance. But security didn't ask, and she didn't volunteer information. She simply existed in the room with Chen, her presence as quiet as her absence had been. The trauma patient down the hall was awake now. A nurse wheeled him to physical therapy. On the way back, he passed room 407. He glanced in. His eyes found Danielle standing by the window, morning light outlining her profile. His body went rigid. The wheelchair almost tipped. "Wait," he whispered. His voice cracked. "Wait. Phantom? Phantom 6. Danielle didn't turn around. But her jaw tightened. She knew that voice. She knew that accent. The Iraqi translator. The man who had walked beside her unit through the streets of Tikrit in 2008, speaking Arabic to civilians, identifying threats, keeping 16 Marines alive because he understood the language of danger before the danger arrived. "Hello, Khalid," she said quietly. The security guard, a retired Marine named Deputy Patterson with a scar that ran from his ear to his collarbone, was standing 20 feet away. He'd heard the code name. Phantom 6. His eyes narrowed. He stepped closer. "You're calling her Phantom 6? He asked Khalid, his voice flat. "That's a Master Chief Petty Officer's call sign. You know what that means." Khalid nodded slowly. "She saved my life. Twice. Once in Tikrit. Once. I didn't know she was here. I didn't know she was in Savannah." Patterson's radio crackled. He didn't answer it. He was looking at Danielle now, really looking at her, seeing the scars on her hands where shrapnel had caught her, seeing the way she stood with the weight of someone who had carried weapons and decisions and the lives of men. "Master Chief Ross," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question. I was just visiting a friend," Danielle said. The doors to the ICU burst open. A Navy admiral walked through, dress whites immaculate, the gold on his shoulders catching the fluorescent light. Vice Admiral Morrison, with 2 aides and a folder. He was looking for Captain Chen. He found Danielle instead, and something in his face shifted. Recognition. Respect. The kind of respect that only comes from reading a file you thought was classified until 3 hours ago. "Master Chief Ross," he said. Danielle turned. She didn't salute. She didn't come to attention. She simply looked at him the way someone looks at an officer when the mission is still running and protocol is still in effect. Admiral Morrison opened the folder. He read portions of her service record aloud to the frozen hallway, his voice steady as a command. 3 combat deployments. 2006 to 2008, Al-Anbar Province. 2010 to 2011, Kandahar. 2014 to 2015, classified AOR. 2 Bronze Stars. He paused. Looked at her directly. A classified operation in Tikrit that saved 17 lives, including the commanding officer now sleeping in room 407. And a Purple Heart you earned in the same operation. And another Purple Heart 3 months later. That's the record. That's who you are. The hallway was so quiet you could hear the ventilator in room 407 wheeze its mechanical rhythm. The security breach in Captain Chen's unit was identified and closed 72 hours ago, Morrison continued. Our investigation is complete. Your assignment is complete. You were never a nurse. You were a Master Chief Petty Officer conducting a classified security investigation into a leak that threatened operational security and the lives of active duty personnel. Cedar Creek Medical has no authority to terminate your employment because you were never their employee. Khalid was crying. Not from pain. From recognition. From seeing a woman he had known as a soldier, watching her fold scrubs in a laundry room, watching her carry a burden no one else could see. Captain Chen woke to voices in the hallway. He heard his name. He heard Phantom 6. He heard Master Chief. He pressed the call button. A nurse came. He asked them to wheel him to the doorway where he could see. By the time he arrived, the Admiral was reading the last page of her file. It says here, Morrison said, that you took shrapnel meant for Captain Chen's vehicle in 2008. That you were medevaced with 3rd-degree burns on your left side and a fragmentary wound across your upper back. That you spent for weeks in a combat support hospital. And that you volunteered for this assignment 6 weeks after your medical clearance, specifically to ensure Captain Chen's recovery while you completed your own rehabilitation. Is that accurate? Yes, sir, Danielle said. Her voice hadn't changed. It was the same voice that had whispered commands to Navy corpsmen in the dark. The same voice that had called a hospital security guard to arrest a doctor. The same voice that had accepted termination without argument because the mission required invisibility. Captain Chen's voice came from behind her. She did that. She took the hit that was meant for us. She pulled me out of the Humvee in Tikrit when she was bleeding out herself. And she came here to make sure I lived because no one else would. 7 doctors refused. 7. And she did it anyway. The silence stretched for 10 full seconds. "Where is Dr. Caldwell?" Admiral Morrison asked. No one answered. Caldwell wasn't in the hospital. Caldwell was home, sitting in his office surrounded by commendations and framed credentials, surrounded by the power that was supposed to be untouchable. But something had gone wrong. Something had broken in the machinery that held him up. The investigator Caldwell had brought in from Atlanta, Dwight Pierce, a former hospital administrator with the bearing of someone who understood institutional corruption, had been auditing Danielle's charts for 72 hours. Looking for malpractice patterns. Looking for missed documentation. Looking for evidence that supported the narrative Caldwell had constructed. Instead, Pierce found something else entirely. He found timestamps. He found signatures. He found instances where Dr. Caldwell had signed surgical notes for procedures he wasn't present for, a pattern stretching back 19 months. 14 instances. 14 physician fees collected for procedures performed by other surgeons. 14 lies embedded in the hospital's official record. Pierce made copies before he understood what they meant. Then he went to the hospital board president. He brought the file. He sat in a conference room surrounded by legal counsel and administrative directors, and he slid the folder across the table. "You asked me to investigate Nurse Ross," Pierce said quietly. "I found documentation irregularities. But not from her." The board president opened the folder. His jaw tightened as he read. Within 48 hours, Dr. Caldwell was suspended pending investigation. Within a week, his medical license was under review by the state board. The 3 hospital board positions he held, the ones that made him untouchable, that kept him on committees and in country clubs and inside the circle of power, all requested his resignation in identically worded letters drafted by attorneys. Caldwell sat in his home office calling in every favor he had left. No one took his calls. His attorney told him to prepare for the worst. The colleague he had covered for, a surgeon with a substance abuse problem, had already given a deposition to federal investigators to avoid his own charges. Caldwell was exposed. The weapon he'd launched to destroy an incompetent nurse had instead blown his own hands clean off. At Cedar Creek Medical, staff members whispered in break rooms about how Caldwell had built his case against the wrong person, how the investigation meant to destroy her had destroyed him instead. The chief of surgery, who had stood in that hallway refusing to help Captain Chen, quietly submitted his retirement notice. No investigation. No negotiation. Just gone. He understood what was coming. He understood that Cedar Creek Medical was about to face lawsuits from every angle, federal review of its safety protocols, possible criminal charges for conspiracy to obstruct medical care. He didn't want to be there when it happened. The state medical board's letter arrived on a Thursday. License revoked. Malpractice hearings scheduled. A recommendation for criminal referral to the Savannah District Attorney's Office. And at the bottom of the page, a single sentence that Caldwell read 3 times before it broke him: "The defendant is hereby prohibited from practicing medicine in any capacity in the United States. He may apply for reinstatement after 10 years if he can demonstrate rehabilitation and maintain a clear record during that probationary period." 6 months later, Danielle stood in her navy dress whites on the grounds of Fort Stewart, just outside Savannah. The summer sun was bright and hot. The parade ground was immaculate. Flags snapped in the wind. A ceremony had been arranged to honor the successful conclusion of a classified security investigation. To honor the service of a Master Chief Petty Officer who had sacrificed her position, her identity, and her professional reputation to protect active duty personnel and close a security breach that could have cost lives. Captain Chen, fully recovered and returned to active duty, stood beside Vice Admiral Morrison. His color had returned. His breathing was steady. His hands were steady as he moved. Marcus, Danielle's son, stood in his Marine uniform, the burned scars on his hands visible when he saluted. They were old scars now. They meant something different now. Chen held the tarnished challenge coin. The one he'd given Marcus in Tikrit. The one Danielle had carried for 8 months. It was polished now. polished to a mirror shine. The bronze gleamed in the afternoon light like something that had been waiting to be restored. He presented it back to Danielle in front of the assembled unit. His voice was steady. Master Chief Ross completed her mission. The security breach was identified and closed. And she saved my life when 7 doctors refused. She's the reason I'm standing here. His salute was sharp and grateful. Danielle returned it with equal precision. The coin passed from his hand to hers. She closed her fingers around it. It was still warm from his hand. Khalid, the Iraqi translator, was there too. Now a U.S. citizen working as a medical interpreter at Naval Hospital Jacksonville. He shook her hand, looked directly into her eyes. Phantom 6, he said with a smile that held 3 years of Tikrit in it. Welcome home. Later, someone asked Danielle how she had managed to stay so composed during those 8 months of humiliation at Cedar Creek. How she had absorbed Caldwell's mockery during grand rounds, the laughter near vending machines, the public destruction of her reputation, and simply folded her scrubs alone in a laundry room without breaking. She thought of Caldwell's voice cutting through the hallway. She thought of the interns laughing. She thought of the security guard walking her out with her badge on his belt. She looked at the challenge coin in her palm, then at Marcus standing beside her in his dress uniform. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said simply. The ceremony ended. The flags came down. Danielle walked across the parade ground with her son, the coin back in her pocket where it belonged, the mission complete, her service record sealed but intact. She was invisible again. That was the nature of classified work. That was the price of this kind of heroism. But this time, invisibility felt like freedom. Somewhere in Savannah, in a community college classroom, Dr. Caldwell stood in front of 12 bored students and demonstrated chest compressions on a CPR mannequin for minimum wage. His framed diplomas were packed away in a storage unit he could barely afford. His medical license was gone. His board positions were gone. His power was gone. He was teaching people how to save lives, and the irony was so complete it might have been poetic if anyone had cared enough to notice. He had tried to destroy someone who carried the weight of actual heroism. And in doing so, he had only destroyed himself. Subscribe to Code Whisperers for more stories of hidden strength and quiet power. Like this video, comment with your thoughts, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the ones who hold it all together.